Hello. We are back again for part two of this topic. So this is Black Mental Health Matters, okay? And so the topic on the 27th was around slavery, racism, and colonialism. And so we wanted to talk a little bit more about the education piece. We touched on it the last time, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper into it to talk about the implications of education and around how colonialism and slavery and racism have impacted just our community in terms of broad education, not just K through 12, but even beyond that. So one of the questions, actually, Dr. Washington sent one of the questions before that. Let's do introductions. We're going to do brief introductions just for the sake of time. I'm not going to read the bios. We can just share, whatever you want to share about yourself, and then we'll go from there, okay? All right, so I'm Dr. Marcia Harris, and I'm owner of Harris and Associates Psychological Services. I specialize in assessments of children and adolescents for determining special education and also for mental health disorders. I have a background in forensic assessments, research in clinical settings, and I teach at Northern Virginia Community College. Dr. Boudreau.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Dr. Andrea Boudreau. I'm a medical psychologist. I specialize in mental health integration into the physical space and understanding how mental health mental and behavioral health impacts your physical well-being. It's great to be with you today.
Yes. Dr. Bruce Golding.
Yes, hello, greetings from England. My name's, Dr. Bruce Golding. I'm a special educational needs coordinator. I've got a background with working with children that had been excluded from school. And I also do psychometric testing, and I'm a mental health first aider. So I've got the community side where I'm trying to help people to become mental health first aiders. And I'm also a suicide first aid tutor as well. So it's great to be with you.
Yes. Dr. Washington, we're just doing introductions, brief introductions right now. We're not reading the bios just for the sake of time. So if you just want to introduce yourself.
Greetings. I am Dr. Kevin Washington, also known as Mwata Kairi. I'm the founder of Ubuntu Psychotherapy. And so I practice, of course, African-centered therapy because we recognize that there is an issue with utilizing the oppressor's form of mental health that may further exacerbate our mental illness. And so we challenge the system of understanding how to be whole, healed, and healthy. And so we use traditional constructs for understanding humanity. So that is the brief piece. I'm also an associate professor at Grambling State University in Grambling, Louisiana. I am the chair of the Psychology Sociology Department. And that's about it.
Awesome. All right. So what I was saying a little earlier, that we're just revisiting the topic that we discussed on March 27th around slavery, racism, and colonialism. And Dr. Washington, you had a question that you sent, and I just wanted to start with that. But we also wanted to give this opportunity for viewers to ask questions because they really didn't get a chance to do that. And because this topic is so heavy and there's so much to discuss, we didn't get a chance for viewers. So viewers, chime in if you have questions. Just send it in the chat, and then I will read them. So one of the questions, Dr. Washington, you had asked is, what are the psychological implications of colonialism on the minds of Black African people? What is our role in decolonizing the Black African mind, the educational curriculum? And so there's a lot to say about this. So if you want to start off, and then whoever wants to jump in.
That's cool. I mean, these are the experts. I'm just simply throwing some stuff out there.
Right.
And we see what sticks. The reality is that we understand that pedagogy, or the construct or the concepts that are utilized in education, are designed to proselytize one into a mode of thinking, because the content that is determined to be consistent or important for the curriculum is tied to culture. And so we know then that whoever tells the narrative, and we heard it several times about the lion story, and whenever the hunter tells a story to be in the favor of him, and the lion tells a story to be in favor of the lion, that always the storyline is told to benefit the one that's telling the narrative. And so European history is designed to create a narrative that puts them in the catbird seat. For example, the discourse around Christianity and Jesus is only 6,000 years, and we look at several a billion years of human existence. The Roman Empire is so small, minuscule when we look at the totality, but we base our system of education on the Greco-Roman construct of education, the Platonic idea of the symposium, so forth and so on. So the reality is that it is designed to promote European superiority, and everyone else is deemed to be inferior. And I think then we have a fundamental role to challenge that. That is to look at what Dr. Asante and others say, that put ourselves at the center of the narrative, the discourse, and then tell the story from that perspective. It doesn't mean that one is replacing white nationalism for the sake of African-centered thought. It means that one is having a corrective narrative where they have agency as well as everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bruce Golding, you had mentioned something the last time resonated with me, is the lens in which our community has to look through in terms of mainstream culture. And can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yes, I definitely resonate with what Dr. Washington is saying. Mm-hmm. I think I've been teaching over 13 years, and both mainstream and special education, many of the students felt so disconnected from what they were learning. They didn't see themselves in the science or everything, geography, everything that they were learning. So there was that disconnection. And I think there's always that question with many of them asking, who am I and where am I from? And that has made me, even when I think about education, the education system and other systems, and how these systems are designed with us not involved in that. So, there's a lot of unions and groups that are getting together to look at decolonizing the curriculum and looking at how can we, reflect the honesty, the real stories. And I think even after hearing Dr. Washington before talking about colonization and the brutality, the savagery, the slavery, all of those things that took place, sometimes you can just read the words or in books, this country was colonized, and then you move on to the next sentence. But when you dig deep, into what the processes of colonization were, how were people treated, how were people made to be, dehumanization of Black and African people. And so I think it's complex, but there's a lot, even when we think about the education system, there's a lot that needs to be undone. Yeah. And the challenge in the UK is, as an educator and looking into how do we get more, Black people, Black teachers. Yeah. The statistics are very difficult because after 5 years, Black teachers are leaving the profession of teaching.
Yeah.
So there's this big gap of what are they actually experiencing. So even before they start, when they enroll on courses, many of them don't get admitted onto the teaching courses. Right. The ones that do, when it comes to qualifying to be a teacher, you have to pass your NQT year, and that's in a school. So I've spoken to teachers who said, I've had a difficult time. They failed me on my NQT year. So, and then we look at the statistics. There's not enough Black teachers. I'd say there's about 10,000 male and female Black teachers in schools in the UK. And so, that's one of the challenges as well. So, and then I know for myself as a teacher, I would make that effort to see everybody in that room and make sure that culture was discussed, identity, and being a source for those young people. So lunch times, I would always have the children in my room telling me about what's going on. I just used to bring my lunch and I'd have it in my room because, and that's what sort of inspired me into sort of thinking, what happens to these children when they get excluded?
Yeah.
So you'd see many teachers feeling like, great, that child's gone now. But I used to think, well, what journey? Where are they going? And I think that has encouraged me to look deeper into the education system. And I keep saying system because I'm seeing that there's all of these systems around us that we have to teach our young people how to navigate through these systems.
Right.
So
absolutely. And I know that, oh, go ahead, Dr. Boudreaux. I was going to.
And I'll just speak from the healthcare system and how physicians and nurses are educated to understand how our symptoms present. On the 27th, we talked about the challenges I had with some of the psychological and psychosocial assessments that we do. But when I think about, we're here in the States, we're about to recognize Black Maternal Health Week, and just what it means and why there are so many more Black women dying in childbirth, in and around childbirth, is because our system, our healthcare system has not been trained to understand. So pain management is not recognized. Comorbidities are not understood. And the providers are not given the education to understand the differences in how we present. And so when you're not in the textbook, you're not in the, we just are missing from that piece of education as well. And the disparities continue to grow.
Absolutely.
So it's a wide array. It's not just in grade school or grammar school. We see it all throughout our work. I can talk, I'm not an attorney. I tell people I play one on TV, but it's the same thing in the law, what's happening. And so when people are not educated to understand culture, right, and understand how people present, I think about a patient I had in the forensic setting. And this young man was robbing carryout people because they didn't have food in their home. Now, I'm not justifying him robbing someone, but let's talk about where that was coming from and what it meant for the system to understand where he was. How do we educate people to understand the cultural context in which our people are engaged so that they can be better at how they provide services? And that's where we're failing across the industry, as you said, Dr. Boudreaux.
Yeah. Absolutely. Before I want to touch on the psychological assessment piece, but before I go there was a question, and this might be really for Dr. Washington. What role did Islam and Christianity play in the slave trade?
So there are two questions. I mean, that's two statements that are really powerful here. One is, of course, when we talk about religion and the influence of it, that everyone brings with them some system of beliefs, and so that gets inculcated into the process of content. Whereas we know that the Arabs indeed they were horrific in how they treated the idea of pillaging, killing African people. They also were not able to disassociate from the knowledge base that was there. So oddly enough, some of the information that we have, that we know about ancient African civilizations, has been retained through the Arab incursion, which is odd, but that's the truth of the matter, because people then seized other people's stuff and they take it and they move it forward. And the same thing with Christianity, and both of those, of course, are Abrahamic religions as well as Judaism. And so they are all a take on African systems of being. So we have to recognize that as well, that they are not the thing. They were simply practices that people saw happening in that space. And so Islam is not the issue or the problem, nor is Christianity. It's the lens through which people began to see the phenomena, and so they came in with their ideology. And so we know that Christians were heavily involved in the enslavement of African people. The papal suggested that because Africans were not human, they had no souls, they could be they could be enslaved, and that was the actual statement in the bullet, said that they have no soul, they can be enslaved. So these are realities that we have to contend with. And so we know that the Portuguese use a ship called the good ship Jesus, as Dr. Browder told us about. And also another statement here says that I think is powerful, which says that the idea of the inferiority complex. And I think that we get that also in religion. Christianity uses the conversation of Ham and being cursed because of dark skin. The book of Nephi, the book of Nephi in the Book of Mormon talks about Nephi and Laman, and one being darker and made to be subservient. So we have this narrative perpetually being played out within religions that suggest who is inferior. There's kafir in the context of kafir in Islam. Sometimes it gets associated with somebody who's darker in complexion. So these are the common issues or themes that run throughout religion. It is to infuse a level of inferiority in a population, no differently from the curriculum that we learn. My parents were school teachers. So I grew up with school teachers. And as a matter of fact, you mentioned earlier in the UK about teachers, as that was Black people went to school in the United States to become either preachers or teachers. Those were the two roles and obligations that they had. Everything else was an anomaly. So to be a medical doctor was an add-on, right? Because the primary function was to be preachers or teachers. So that was key. So when you remove people, Black people from the classroom, you do a grave disservice to a population. I'll close with this one by saying that we know that African American children, now we can't speak for other spaces, but African American children that have a Black teacher before the 5th grade have a greater likelihood of completing high school, completing school through high school, and the greater possibility of performing well in college, because there's something that happens in the mind, the psyche of a child, where they begin to see themselves as being agents of change. That is very important. So we must do two things, and there are two topics here. One is understand the presence of teachers, but just to be present and still brainwashed is a grave disservice. Right. The second one is to understand content. And so we don't need the Eurocentric system to educate our children. We need to have the content, the curricula, so that we can educate our children the way we need to. And that's a big challenge for us. So we can't pass these various tests because they are gatekeepers to make sure that people come into the school system are thinking in a way that is consistent with Eurocentric thought. And that's a problem. So just because you have a Black face doesn't mean that you don't have white skin, France Fanon. So we have to recognize that people can look like us, but they're not of our kind. So it is how your mind is functioning that really matters. Right.
Absolutely. Speaking of tests, psychological tests, Pearson is one of the largest assessment distributors, in the world, in the U.S. I'm not sure if they're in the UK, but I know that here in the U.S., Pearson distributes many assessments. And so they just released a webinar talking about the biases of testing, which was really interesting. And I'm going to quote what the presenter said. And, it's between 1900 and 1915 is when intellectual tests started, around that time, just in terms of education and ability. And so this presentation, the presenter stated, a lot of the early intellectual measures were designed to use in a wide range, were not designed to use in a wide range of cultures. So it was geared more towards mainstream culture. And so in the 1980s is when they started to develop more culturally sensitive, tests. However, some of those tests still don't capture like the comprehension and the language piece, which I find problematic. So we're looking at crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. A lot of our kids do better on the fluid test versus the verbal comprehension test. And so what I tend to do is have parents in our community. Exposure is one of the biggest things. A lot of the kids with high IQs, they traveled, they've gone abroad, they've gone to museums, they've done lots of different things where, a lot of our kids have not, done those things. And so I tell parents, as one of the recommendations, is just simply going down the street to a museum or taking their child to the store and giving them money and saying, okay, I'm going to have you go to the cashier. How much money do you have? How much is that item? Just to build those quantitative skills, to build those, verbal skills, because, exposure. Let me just share a personal story with you all. Again, as I mentioned before, I performed a lot of assessments around the DC metro area. And so, you see the disparity between, some schools in DC versus the other schools, like we mentioned, on the other side of the river, right? So this one school in Georgetown, every Wednesday, the kids had a field trip. They went wherever, exposing every Wednesday. every Wednesday, half day. They went to a theater, they went to a museum, they went all, places. Versus, the other side, I very rarely saw that. These kids very rarely got field trips, and when they did, it was going to the zoo or something like that. You know what I mean? So these are critical things, and then we can even talk about Common Core standards and how that also systemic racism with regard to the standards, what our kids need to know. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. I recall. So I also was here in DC for my some of my clinical practice, and it was painful.
Yeah.
But even from outside, one of the things I enjoyed doing was being able to step away from the clinical work.
Yeah.
And I was a big sister.
Right.
And my little sister lived in what, for those of you who are here will know Ward 8, but it's the poorest and the most, they're gentrifying it today, but it is the poorest area of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, I'm going to take you, I wanted to take her to a museum. And so here's this child who lives 5 miles from the White House. And for all intents and purposes, she may as well have lived in the UK. The White House was such a foreign concept to her. That was not her reality. She didn't feel connected to being in the nation's capital. And that's the reality. That's what our children are dealing with. We see kids who are in middle school who are having to get jobs to help with taking care of the family and resources for the family. And I want to be very clear. I don't think this is just a poverty issue that we have a problem, but it is certainly a challenge when you layer socioeconomic status into the conversation. So there are wealthy people who also have we can talk about those of us in middle class, upper middle class who also experience this. But when you add that layer of poverty onto this already broken system, you see such poor outcomes. And so when a child is made to feel that they can't do anything, so Dr. Washington, you talked about preachers and teachers, and I'll tell you, growing up in the South, it was you need to put a ball in your hand. And so they were encouraged. It doesn't matter if you can read or not, can you play ball? Because that's the way to make it out. And so there's this system, and we watch Black boys going to these Division I schools, not forced to go to class, and when I say forced, everyone else is, right? So if I don't go to class, I'm put out. These kids aren't going to class, they're passing because they're able to play. And that's why I say this, Dr. Bruce Golding, when you called it a system and industry, that's exactly what it is. There is no way to ensure that our children are safe in this place, that they get what they need. And it's devastating to see, especially when you layer socioeconomic status on top. So it's something, that's why I'm glad to be here, even though I don't, I'm not the education expert, but I see how it's interwoven into all of our work.
Right.
So
I totally agree with that. I think even just thinking about the children that I would work with, that you also, your mindset, well, my mindset was always to think about the families, because and in many cases you'd find out that, the parents their education or their knowledge was limited. They've got responsibilities. So it comes down to survival sometimes for these children. It's about surviving and getting, like you said, having the jobs or doing things on the side to bring money in. But it's how I feel is that it's an unfortunate cycle, because that if couples have children, and the challenge in looking after them and preparing them for an education system, that they are not, they haven't got that sense of belonging within the school system. And so this cycle, prison to pipeline cycle, continues. And to add, like you said, poverty, and on top,
I wanted to add this because I mean the points are so powerful. About you mentioned about exposure to content, and then also about Dr. Udo, you mentioned about basketball or sports. It is important to understand that what a test is testing. I also have a master's degree in ed psych, so we have to deal with the issue of psychometrics. To understand that a test is testing the degree to which you have mastered the content of that test, which is tied to culture. And so it is not that a child is deprived of exposure to a museum. And I understand the overarching process, because at one point I thought that was the thing until I began to dig deeper with Dr. Asa Hilliard and other scholars. It is not that's not the issue. The issue, because you can get the content, and I do believe that the greatest amount of learning occurs out of the classroom. I believe that when children have exposure to a variety of stimuli that comes in the context of navigating an environment, that's what we talk about, the general general intelligence and the Sternberg and the Gardner's idea of the variety of multiple intelligences. Those are real issues, right? Real concerns. And so we know that Lewis Terman started the intelligence test in the United States in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1916, I believe that was the year when he looked at the work that was being done by Binet and Simon in France. And so that's why you have the Stanford Binet test. We also know that Lewis Terman was a part of the human betterment movement that was looking at ways of assessing individuals to determine who should be sterilized and who should not be sterilized. And so we recognize that there was a process there. The thing that we don't call out is the fact that the only intelligence test that existed in this country was the one that Terman designed, and he's a part of the human betterment movement. And what determined if you were better is taking an IQ test. So he was getting paid, so he was actually proving a point, and his premise was that dullness. This is his statement. I'm paraphrasing. Dullness is common among the American Indian of the Southwest and the Chinese, and very, very common among the Negro. So he had a premise, and he had to prove his premise. So the naissance of testing in this country is predicated on the construct of the inferior nature of African people and those deemed to be not white. And then you have David Yerkes and others developing the Army Beta and Army Alpha tests that determine infantry and that determine those who should be officers. Now, I want to show the parallel between the two. Is that if the test, even the Yerkes test, had the same philosophy that the Africans or Black people were inferior, and so they gave them a test, and they would deem to be the infantry, they would be on the front line. People who are on the front line who fight typically will lose their lives, which means you have a faulty test engaging in the process of determining who should get killed, which is a form of genocide, which is the same thing that happened with Lewis Terman's ideas that I give you this test and it is genocide. If you talk about moving to what Bruce Golden said about the prison to pipeline process, it is still genocide. So the agenda has not shifted through the utilization of assessment. So we have to be clear, right, about the process is cultural ideology infused or masked as this thing that is innocuous as a test, but in reality, it is to promote an ideology, and that ideology we suffer from. So we have to be able to challenge it. Now, I'm not saying throw the baby out the bathwater, all tests are wrong. No, I'm saying that their design is flawed, the content, the process is contaminated, and that we can use it for our benefit, but we have to be present to make sure that's used properly. And so another point, a sub point, is that we know that children, you mentioned an idea about fluid and crystallized intelligence. We know that typically, and that goes into the Kaufman assessment battery, right? The KBC. We know that individuals, Black children tend to perform better on the test when they have a Black test provider. That was the work of the earliest Black psychologists in this country. If you go look at the work of Inez Beverly Proza, you just go historically. We know history. As a matter of fact, one person, and I just lost his name just talking. I'm talking too much. But one of the earliest Black psychologists wanted to do his dissertation on Negroes with superior intelligence. He was told by his school that he could not do the test because there were no Negroes of superior intelligence. He found over 10 Negroes with superior intelligence, 3 of which had the highest IQ of anybody in this country. We never learn in school about them and that test.
Yeah.
We learn about everybody else.
Right.
But I read that storyline in a book by Robert Guthrie called "Even the Rat Was Right." Right. So we have to read and study better. And so where I was going, closing out here is that the earliest read the Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. He says that the Negroes went to college for the purpose of preachers and teachers. That's what Woodson writes about when he went through and looked at the education of the Negro throughout the South and other areas, right? And so what happens is that it wasn't until the 70s when there was a shift where the ball became the thing. But remember, all of them are the same thing. People went to go teach to try to help the community to become better. The ball game was to get out of poverty. But even to this day, we have more Black students going to college who have an interest in education or in psychology or in criminal justice because they want to impact social change, right? And so it's not that Blacks are not in STEM education. Right. It's the fact that they can't see how it relates to anything that's going to make a difference. So our challenge then is to show that STEM education is a social justice movement because we begin to address hypertension, diabetes, prostate cancer, just as anybody else. Why is there more money and research given to leukemia than to sickle cell? Because somebody has an agenda. Why is why is there the higher crime, the higher punishment for the crime of crack cocaine than cocaine? Because somebody had a legal agenda. We have to send our children to school to see that there are connections that are made between this and that. So when they go take a test, they're going to take a test with an agenda and not to say that I'm going to be defeated once again. So we know about Aaron Steele's work about the what is it called again? Aaron Steele's work in the fallacy around which we begin to perform worse because we believe that we're going to perform worse on this assessment. Anyway, yeah. I'm losing the name, Dr. Boudreaux. I apologize, but it'll come back in a moment. It'll come back.
There's a couple of things I just wanted to touch. That I do have a question here, but I'm going to say this first. Is you, Dr. Washington, actually, Dr. Bruce Golding, you mentioned the evaluation of teachers, and that is a huge problem in the system. Is the harsh evaluation of teachers and service providers. It's unrealistic to expect the expectations of service providers and having these gigantic caseloads of students and having to write these 30-page reports for each one and giving each one the attention that's needed to determine eligibility or determine the appropriate recommendations or accommodations. It is outrageous. And some of these evaluations are so ridiculous. And the teachers are teaching Common Core. They're not necessarily, and pushing these kids along because of, their impact scores, being affected by, their student scores. So that's another problem we have in the system is, the evaluation of teachers and service providers instead of, looking at supporting the kids and writing reports that support their needs. It's almost like they're writing reports to meet the criteria for the evaluation. And yes. That's how it should be. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I think as well, even when we look at the British education system, there's not enough educational psychologists and Black ones as well. So I think it's very difficult because the whole process of training to become ed psych takes up to about 5 years, and then you've got to get the grades to get into that position as well. And so we need, and I think that's the route that I'm considering at the moment, because I'm thinking, in all of my years, I'd never seen a Black educational psychologist working with a child. And you think, what does that do? What message? And the challenge is, which I talked to another lecturer a couple of weeks ago that if they're trained from a Western eye, they have no cultural understanding of the children that they're working with, the natural bias will go towards children that look like them. And so normally with Black boys, they're seen as aggressive. They're seen, it's all the negative stereotypes. So their actual needs are not being met. And so many of them do get excluded from school. And so that cry for help and that support, they're looking around and thinking, well, they can't relate to anybody that can help them. And, as Dr. Washington said, you might see even seeing the odd Black teacher, they might be under that pressure of thinking, well, if I engage with this child, then maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe I need to distance and be in the in-group so that there's a safe distance, instead of looking out for the needs that are not going to be met appropriately. And so I think even in the world of psychology and the training of future psychologists, how are they actually going to address that? And that's the challenge when we think about in the UK, Black and African people make up to about just over 3% of the population. So those are some of the challenges. So if we know that we've got challenges with teachers entering into the teaching system, challenges with them being kept in that system, being teachers, kept in their role, but also challenges once in the role. And teaching how, they may be scrutinized, or we now have something called the British values. Since 2014, we have to, make sure that British values that's sort of a mandatory thing that you follow within the school system. Yeah. So even that you're watching out on how it's interpreted, how, the spread of the reinforcement of British values. However, you might have a class that is from different cultural backgrounds, but yet British values has to be held as a priority. And I think that's going to be the challenge for teachers, Black teachers of colour in the classroom. I remember even with working with children in the unit, I would speak Patois to them, and so they would be like, Miss, and I'd talk to them and say, talk to them about the work that needs to be done. And, I didn't have any problems, but I had to speak to them in a language that they knew, and I could just give that look. And I said, I want my work, and they would work. Yeah. And I would talk to them about how important they were and what difference they could make. But then it's one thing doing that in the classroom, but then when you get out into society, then the challenge of, well, they've got the other battle,
right?
And I think that's just a challenge. It's a challenge,
right? We have a question. Can I just ask this question? Give me 1 second. It was here. What are your thoughts on critical race theory being taught in the public school systems? And I'm not familiar.
Okay.
Well, I personally think it's important, even though, our government have said that that's not, the right thing to do. It's not to be taught in that sort of way because of it's divisive. Yeah. But I think it's important to make sure that young people are versed in being critical, being able to look at different sides and being able to unpick what is actually going on. And I think that's really, really important. Otherwise, it's almost that sort of, I look back and I relate. You sort of open your mouth and you're spoon-fed what you're supposed to be, you're supposed to learn, instead of being able to challenge that. Mm-hmm. And I think, I think it's important. It's an important part of reasoning and learning. I think that's an important part of learning, which I've only, over the last 15 years, sort of I'm seeing the importance of critical race theory.
Right. So I'm not familiar with that curriculum, but I will say I think it's important for us to be able to call race out. This is so important, and I can, as I look in health policy and how we again are looking to impact training of physicians and other providers, having the conversation that race matters is it's so difficult to bring in. So while I don't know critical race curriculum, I'll say bringing that piece in has been avoided. It's been, people walk around it, and we don't want to bring how important that work is. I shared on the 27th the challenge that I would have the entire semester with my professor as we looked at assessing African Americans and what that meant for our culture to be brought in. And so when we talk about norms and how race impacts the norms that these tests were developed around, and how pathology is assigned based on norms that do not take your culture into perspective. It's important for us to be able to say there is systemic racism. This topic is something that I've done so much around this last month. And one of my colleagues said it best. We are not, race is not the factor that causes us to have poorer outcomes. It's racism. Mm-hmm. So my body is not broken because I'm Black, and I don't have a higher likelihood to get heart disease because I'm Black. It's the racism in this world that makes my life and your understanding of me makes me more likely to get heart disease and have some of these comorbidities. So how do we bring that? And that's a conversation that for too many, it's uncomfortable to have. And so I think when we stop hiding from the conversation, while it's difficult, because no one wants to put the mirror up and look at themselves as part of the problem, that's when we get to solutions. So it's just important for us to be able to call it out and not be afraid to say where there is opportunity for us to improve. And that is a major area for every aspect of our world.
And I think we all mentioned the historical component as, history books, the US and as well as the UK. I know you mentioned Dr. Bruce Golding, is just in terms of looking at it through mainstream culture and I know, Dr. Washington, you mentioned about the three men that had the highest IQ. Although I think slavery is an important part of our history, how about all the pioneers that's never discussed? In the schools, every time I walk by my kid, I have the youngest who's in 5th, and I have an oldest who's in the 10th grade, 2 sons. And, every time he's doing social studies, I cringe because I'm like, can we stop talking about Columbus finding the Americas? I just want to tear the book up and throw it in the trash. And I have to educate my sons on all the wonderful, pioneers and what other things that we've done. And it's unfortunate that I didn't even know these things growing up. I wasn't aware until like maybe in college that, there were so many Blacks involved in, lots of different areas and fields and have done so many things for this country. And you don't discover these things too much later on. And unfortunately I have the opportunity to teach my kids at an early age of all the great things that Blacks and people of color have done. But that's one of the biggest problems is, how do we get to address, or how do we get to the top of changing these books and reflecting the truth and putting in what is really, giving credit to, a lot of people of color who have done wonderful things, in the U.S. and abroad. So what are your thoughts on that?
I wanted to say this. Roddy to say that the old man should talk less. So that's a challenge. The old man, let the ladies talk. So we'll let that, we'll let it roll like a slide. I told her, hey, look, the gray is what is. I've been growing gray since I was 3 years old. So it's no issue. That's real talk. And so it is what it is, Dr. Boudreaux. It is what it is. The critical race theory is done by Kimberly Crenshaw. She talks about the intersectionality of race, class, and gender. And so he says that these things are the things that impact people's survival or livelihood in a given space. And so it's a very intricate piece of work that allows us to be able to see how race, class, and gender impacts how we flow. And I think that what you said, Dr. Boudreau, is so powerful about it's not a race. Your colleague says not a race, but racism. We're doing work now, again, reading this work on anti-racism, how to start a conversation to take action about the anti-racist. We're also doing a piece. This has happened to be because I'm working on another project, so it's not like I'm trying to show out. I'm not. But a workbook by Ibram Kendi and what you said about killing us. I think I may have shared this before about Black fatigue, how racism erodes the mind, body, and spirit. Right? People get tired of talking about the same old thing. And again, this is the actual book about how to be an anti-racist by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And again, the reason why we have the conversation is because we try to make sense of the world. And this one is very powerful in its title. It's called My Grandmother's Hand. But look at the subtitle, which says Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, right? And so it's a very thing that you all mentioned is that dealing with the idea of racist notions, the idea of a curriculum can make me sick, right? You know, going into school and learning about Columbus and the story that I have about my daughter who's now a senior, my youngest daughter who's now a senior in high school, preparing to graduate. When she went to middle school, she texted me one day and she says, "Daddy, I don't know, pyramids were built by aliens." That was the first one. I remember this in order. And she said, "LOL." Then about a week later, she sent me, "Daddy, Adolf Hitler did not go into Africa to steal anything because there wasn't anything of value to steal in Africa. Take out Africa, LOL." And then it was again, LOL. The next one, about a week later, she says, "Daddy, slavery helped Black people to be better, LOL." Right? And the question becomes, how could she send to me such heinous? And this is, again, she's a senior in high school. So this is five years ago, right? So it's not like it's a long time ago. 6 years ago, how could she send LOL? Because she had information had been taught to her that was an inoculate that allowed her to see that as a joke, right? Because I had taught her mother had taught her about some aspects of who she was, to understand who the ancient Cometians were, what was enslavement, how did it function. Now it wasn't always just drilled every single day, but it was part of conversation that took place. But how many children who were her cohorts that didn't have the information to fight the virus, right? They didn't have the vaccine, the intellectual vaccine, to be able to combat and not allow it to become a part of who they are. And I think that we have a responsibility, and Dr. Nate said it best, that we have to challenge the system on all fronts. And it's not one person, it's all of us, intellectually, the assessment system, the curriculum. But I think many times we're fighting and swinging and don't know that there are other people out here swinging with us.
Yeah.
And this is such a wonderful opportunity to come together, realize that, wait a minute, this is a global thing. I had no idea about Dr. Bruce Goldman doing her work. So the idea here is to understand that we have responsibility. And someone even said that religion is the problem. And I want to go back and say this, and then because I want to make sure I hit that question. Re means to go back. Allegiance means to bind. So religia, or religare, which is a Latin word, means to go back and to tie and to connect. The function of religion is to move people to connect with something greater than themselves. And I will say again that the religion is not the problem, right? The issue is that if you're in a vehicle to go someplace and you only blow the horn and clean the windows, but you never drive anywhere, then it's a useless vehicle. Religion is useless because it's not driving people to a higher reality. It's the ideology that gets infused into religion that becomes the problem. And so if I come into religion with an agenda, I've already been taught that I'm superior to other people. I only put that inside of my religion to justify my thinking. And then I use religion to back that up because God said. God told me that all this belongs to me, manifest destiny. Well, no, God never said that. That's you telling yourself that using something else to justify your position. So my point is that we must understand that religion The idea of spirituality is ancient African understanding of how to connect. It has flaws. I'm not saying that it's imperfect, but it's not the problem. It's people with ideology that's jacked up. That's the real problem.
Right. So we have about 10 minutes. Time flies, especially talking about this subject. And I want to respect everyone's time. So I did want to ask this. Well, I have two questions, but I think the one will probably take us over. So let me just start with this one. Is in terms of your experience, what is that one experience that you can remember that have led you to kind of be where you are? What is that? It could be a positive or negative experience, but what's that one experience that you can remember, I guess in school or along the way in your training that made you feel that, okay, this is it. This is what I have to do. This is what I need to go. This is the path I need to go.
I'll do two really quickly because they shape so much.
Right.
I'm a 2-time breast cancer survivor. I don't know if I shared that the last time.
Mm-hmm.
My church wrapped their arms around me and encouraged me to, are you getting your mammograms? How are you doing? How are you feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same church that until we started work, now my church is I think very forward thinking in the work that they've done around mental health. But it was the work, it came out of people feeling that you pray away mental health, you pray away depression. But we brought this mammogram unit. Now they didn't bring it because of me. That was something the church has been doing long before my diagnosis. But you pray away mental health, but you go to the doctor. And why is our religion? So you're talking about how does religion impact our faith? There was such a disconnect that people had with their faith and being able to seek what they needed. And so I really wanted to look at how to use this vehicle, Dr. Washington, that was so embedded into our community to help our community. My leaving practice, I'll go back to that patient. I get a phone call that he's being discharged from a hospital because his insurance had run out. And how I felt, because I knew what this child was going to go back home to. I knew he was not safe. And these people they didn't tell me, oh, we think he's better. They said his insurance is running out. And I said, this broken healthcare system is going to kill my people because we can't afford we have mental health parity, but if we don't have mental health parity, this system will kill us if we don't fix it. And so while I love seeing patients, while I loved being able to be in the room, and I tell you every day, it's hard for me to not be there. He's not the last. He wasn't the first. And it shifted where I wanted to be because people are dying because we don't have things in place. Right. And so that shifted everything for me, that it wasn't just about me being in practice and, there are not enough people who look like us in practice. And so you have to stay. There's some bigger things at play. And we needed me in the room to hold people accountable. And so that's what I'm doing, holding people accountable at the highest level of healthcare. And so that's what I've committed my career to doing moving forward, to ensure that we have a voice in the room where decisions are being made.
Absolutely. That's good, because that was actually the second part of the question was just how to move forward. That's perfect. Someone else want to go?
Yes. Okay. My question that came up to mind, I'll be quick, is that will the system be fixed, or do we work around the system?
Right.
And find ways that, in the education system is what it is, and we have to work within communities to try and build either racial socialization or build the confidence and identity and confidence in young Black children. But also for me, my experiences in where I am, I feel like I'm on a journey. Still lots to learn. So keep talking, Dr. Washington, because I'm writing and I'm learning. So it's all good. But I think for me, teacher training, I went into a school and I looked at how the teacher was teaching the children. And I thought, that's how I don't want to teach. I want to teach and I want to make a difference. So that's what impacted me. Also, when I had my role in a mainstream school, I did a lot of things around race and culture. And I remember holding a big school Black History event in the evening. There was quite a bit of a few barriers with staff members, but there were enough staff, Black and people of colour, on board. So we invited Jamelia. I don't know if you've heard of her, local, well, she's an international singer, but she was born in Birmingham, so she's a proper Birmingham lady. And she came and she talked, and it was amazing because we had girls dancing, doing Bhangra, doing hip hop, doing everything, ballet, and it was just amazing. So when we get young people engaged, involved, and empowered, it's amazing what they can go on and do. And that was over 10 years ago. And I'm hoping that they remember those. And even when I still see those girls in town, they come up and hug me. So, it's doing what you can do. But I always have questions around these systems. They're embedded, law systems, education systems, healthcare systems. Are they, how long will it take to change, or do we have to work around them to support our people?
That's a good point. Very good point. Dr. Washington?
I had moved the mic back. I was done. I was just so I was out of this conversation.
Yeah.
Pivotal points. A childhood friend of mine's father had this beautiful artwork in his house, and it was, I didn't know, I was looking at Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines and others. I just knew that the artwork was very beautiful. His family was from Haiti.
Yeah.
And so I said, what did your dad do? Because I figured if I did what his dad did, I could have this artwork in my house. And so he said, my dad is a doctor. And so I knew we called him Dr. Briere, but, okay, what does he do? So found out that he was an OBGYN. And so I realized what they did. And it's like, I don't think I want to do that. So I redirected myself, but I wanted to do work, be a healer. And so so that's how I ended up in psychology. Longer story, but how I ended up in the space of the idea of liberating the African mind is several stories can take place. But one of them was at Texas A&M. When I was in, I observed something very keenly. That is that when you come into the institution, it used to be a military institution. They would come in wearing a black belt as a lower level. And as you got older, the next year, the sophomore year, junior year, you had a white belt. And I began to recognize how one was being, again, indoctrinated into white superiority very subtly. I read Frances Cress Welsing's book, The ISIS Papers, and I began to see certain things about games. And she talks about the game of pool and billiards, and so about how the ultimate clash is between the black ball and the white ball. And so I was listening to her talk, and I began to look at the world differently. And I began to notice that, for example, in football, the referee, the real referee wears a white cap, and the subordinates wear black caps. I began to examine other things that were happening that suggested this idea of white superiority. It was very subtle. It wasn't like it was somebody plastering the big sign up. And I began to see then curricula and began to understand curricula. I wanted to study more about curricula in grad school. That's why I was in ed psych. And so just thinking about those things and understanding assessments as well, those things said, how do I make a difference? And so I began to create the curriculum for rites of passage programs for Black males in this small town that I was in school. And so that began to make me popular. I began to speak more. I was not a speaker at that time, And I had realized that if I'm speaking, I had to research some stuff. So I had to research to be able to speak to people. And I had to research to be able to develop these programs. And so that became so empowering. And I realized the importance of content, of information, internal form, shape, Asian process. So the idea information is the process of changing your inner being. And so psychology became that avenue for me because I began to think about Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Murani, anthropologist, Dr. Linda James Myers. I began to study their works. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, who was a historian, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakanan. As I studied, I began to recognize, and Dr. Amos Wilson, how one is changed by the content that they receive about who they are. It changes how you walk in the world. And so I think that that is the way that I look at psychology, is how to change the inner being of a person so that they have a different walk in the world. So for me, psychology as a practice for oppressed people is an act of social justice, not simply one of making you feel better. So education is the same way. It must be an act of social justice where people begin to liberate themselves from their own mental incarceration to walk into the power of their greatness. And so that's kind of how I ended up in this space.
This is an awesome. I cannot believe the time it's already 1 o'clock. I just want to close us out with this. Just in my experience, when I was told I couldn't do something, I told myself I could, and that's what I did. And then in graduate school, a Black professor invested in me and said you could do it, and that's why I'm doing what I do. And I feel so privileged to be sitting with you all during this discussion. And it's never enough time. It's like I could talk about this forever. So we will have to stay in touch, and in the future we'll do another show. But I appreciate your time. I know that the Saturday people have things to do, and I really appreciate the time you took to sit and discuss this really important topic.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. You're welcome.